First of all, the Digital Classicist. It's a community, decentralized, so there are people all over the world, and also the organization is decentralized, with an interest in the applications of digital technologies to the ancient world. And the ancient world is intended as Altertumswissenschaft, so a very broad conception of the ancient world, not only Greek and Latin, so to say. And there are several channels of communication. There is a wiki, there is a website, and since 3 years, we have started also in Berlin. I mean, the seminars are one of the activities of this community. So there is a seminar in London, which has been running since 2007, in Berlin since 3 years, and now it's starting also across the pond. So in the US, there will be the New England branch starting next spring term. And this is all almost self-organized by the members of the community. And the seminars have these characteristics of being work in progress. So we meet to discuss work in progress ideas, reports. We do it every 2 weeks. And the first part of the seminar, it's usually it's a presentation, and then it's followed by a more formal discussion. And after the more formal discussion, there is just wine and nibbles, and we just continue the discussion with the wine. The lecture and the first part of the discussion is recorded, and then the rest is not recorded. Just to so that you feel comfortable asking your questions. For students, from this year, the seminar is also a Lehrveranstaltung, so it's can be part of your curriculum, and basically what you should do is to attend the seminars, make sure that you sign the attendance list so that we know that you were here, and to get the 5 credits for the seminar, there will be a final presentation at the end with some posters, and in the poster you can present basically some ideas that you got during the seminars that are relevant for your research or that you found interesting. So there is also some kind of participation by the students. And the poster presentation will be after the seminar, I think in April. But there will be more, also online in the program of the courses of the FU. There are also information about when is the appointment for the poster presentations. So the attendance list, I don't think I've forgotten anything. No. So I'm really glad to introduce Charlotte Roueché, who will be giving the opening keynote for this year's seminar series. So we begin each seminar series with a keynote speaker. And this year is Charlotte Roueché from King's College London. And she will talk about digital classics Back to the Future, with a really cool title, I thought. She has been publishing online and offline in more traditional ways, mostly about descriptions of Aphrodisias and Ephesus for several years. And she has been an early adopter of digital technologies, in particular Epidoc for inscriptions. But I will just let it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. I'm a classicist who became digital. Think of it like that. When I began, digital wasn't an option. So I represent the passage from the past to the future. And my ambition, I couldn't start speaking at the DAI without this image. And it's a very significant image because he's sitting there with his book, surrounded by these objects. And he's about to release on the classical world, the respectable, well-behaved classical world, a tsunami of material. Because he's going to say to these very respectable classicists, there's lots of stuff. There's all that stuff, all those objects. What are you going to do about them? You can't ignore them. And in some ways, we've been trying to deal with the consequences of that ever since. Now, I work on inscriptions, and I'm going to show you lots. I'm going to show you many too many pictures, because that's what I like to do. Lots and lots and lots and lots of pictures. If you're in the 18th century, you go at the early 19th century, you're on a site and you see some inscriptions. What do? You copy the text. And the reason I always use this page is because this man could draw. You can see he could draw. He did not draw the stones. Was he wrong? Was he right? He was probably right, because it takes longer if you make a drawing. And here you are in a very difficult environment. So what do? You collect the texts. So that the early stages of objects arriving are either beautiful things or texts which we find on stones. So to begin with, I think, it's difficult for people to realise what's happening. Now, here is a nice English traveller. Very respectable man, travelled a lot in Greece, collected antiquities, reported antiquities, naturally. And here is my hero. I just love him. And if you have an empty hour, you should read CIG one more time. It's very good for your Latin. And what a man. Because he just said, okay, but this is Berlin, I'm a Berliner, so of course I'm going to organise it. Because that's what people do in Berlin, they organise things. And except for airports. Now, my ambition for digital classics is to return. We will have achieved our end when we have returned to the 1840s. That's our destination. Because that represents a period of experiment combined with communication and very high scholarly standards, all at once. And I love this letter. It's everything for an epigrapher. It was given by Leek has been given the copies made by that man Deering, whose copy you saw. He publishes them briefly, and then he sends them to Burke. He only has to write Professor Augustus Burke, Berlin, because that's all you need to say. And he sends them to him so that he can put them in his big corpus. There is no no restraint, no, this is my material. None of this copyright nonsense. Sharing material. And what does the Academy do? Later on, they give the copies to Louis Robert when they knew, in the 20th century, when they knew he was working on this material. So that document represents freedom of ideas, sharing of data. Let's get back to that. Let's try and achieve that. Now, the problem with classical studies, and I'm not going to say Altertumswissenschaft because classics is a quicker word, is that they have been fragmented. You put little bits together. And since that's what I do in my day job, I'm interested in how you combine things. But since Winkelmann, there has been a steady process of fragmenting classical studies. I'm afraid to say that Germany has played a part in this, in the separation of something mysterious called philology, which sits over there. Well, you can't avoid philology if you work on inscriptions. It's often a personal task, putting your fragments together. So, what if you are working on inscriptions, something pops out of the ground. You can't choose it, it just comes. And you have to apply whatever knowledge you need to whatever it is that's popped up. And if you're sensible, you go and ask other people. But you will need all of these aspects. You will be engaging with all of these. So, that is what Altertumswissenschaft involves. And if we try to say that there is one piece you don't need, we destroy the whole object of the understanding of the whole of the ancient world, which is what the great fathers of the subject wanted us to have. And what we have to do is to recreate that unity, which is not easy. So language is easy. When I show people this beautiful poem, which has the virtue of including the word praikipouan, otherwise unknown in Greek, and votis, for the Latin votis. Now, when I show that to the philologists, they're not very interested. I think they think it isn't beautiful. But this is all part of the culture of the language of the ancient world. You can't leave it out just because it's on stone. Interestingly, papyri are allowed in through the door, but inscriptions are kept outside. So that's one aspect. Objects, obviously. So you get a nice monument like this. It all looks quite straightforward. What's happening on top? It took us some time to find this. I have no idea why there is a hole made in the top. The inscription is on the side. Can I publish the inscription and not talk about that? The archaeology, obviously enough. Location, this tells us about locations in Ephesus. And just a nice example, here's the embolos at Ephesus. Notice all those little blocks along there. That's a view of them. There are a whole series of statue bases. As you can see, then they don't match. When you look at them in the corpus of inscriptions, there is no discussion of their location or of what they look like. So that what you can't see is that what they have in common is that they were all dedications to victory, which explains why this statue was found with them. They were dedications to victory, used for local competitors, and then assembled to honour a 4th century empress. So, pleasing stuff. But you have to look at the objects and read the texts. Art history, well, I'm not going to say much about that because I don't do art. But that's what I think is beautiful. But here's the man who stood on it. Whether he's beautiful or not, I'm not quite sure. But it's useful to know that if you go to Aphrodisias, where this was found, the statue is in the museum, the base is in the museum garden, and this bit of the base is still on the site. They have only been, I know that Bert is trying to bring them all together, but for a long time they were only assembled in this drawing. The inscription is important, well, I think it's interesting for other reasons. They like it because it helps them date this beautiful piece of art. Even more beautiful with its inscription on the base. But that's what we're used to. The association of statues and texts, that's not very exciting. And the other thing that we think of as typical of inscriptions is events and institutions. You can write a nice thesis by collecting all the inscriptions which mention something, making a list and publishing them. It makes everybody happy. And it's always useful to have these lists. So you can have these nice letters for the emperors, but it's actually interesting where they are. It's interesting that they're part of a building. You can have a boring old governor and you can find out all sorts of things. That's what people expect from epigraphy. There's social history. The correct thing to find in your inscriptions is women. But actually, that's not what I'm looking for. But this sort of thing is nice. This has always been a problem. If you go to your swimming pool now, you will see exactly the same notice. Deposit, we will not be responsible for your valuables if you don't deposit them. You've seen that sign a million times. There are 2 copies of this at Aphrodisias. And the reason this site is interesting is not because the people were exceptionally dishonest. It's because the marble is very easy to cut. And so people cut messages which otherwise they probably would have painted, so we wouldn't have them. Because in fact, this sign must have been found in every single bath building in the ancient world. It's just that normally it just will have been chalked. And in the same way, a site like that with very generous marble gives you all sorts of nice things, like a tightrope walker, which broadens your understanding of the Roman stage. Or this nice, everybody loves gladiator. In the Pergamon Museum, when did I go? Yesterday, must have been. I noticed that they had some nice Thracians bringing offerings to Darius, I think. And they've got them in the little Persian collection. And with nice, they said, typical of a Thracian is this nice round shield. I was very pleased about that, because if you read books about Roman gladiators, because you know there are lots of people who know everything about Roman gladiators, it's that sort of subject, they will tell you that a Thracian gladiator has a square shield. Well, he may well, but this one is called Thrax, and he's got a round shield. So what are we going to do with that? Is it just possible that in a 300-year period across the whole of the Mediterranean, not everything was always the same? So the lists that we've all been making then come apart again and don't quite work. So all of these are questions that you may find yourself having to ask because your inscription, I didn't know anything about gladiators before we found these. I had no interest in gladiators at all. I think they're deeply boring, even the film. But I had to find about them because there they were. So you have to be prepared for every aspect of the ancient world. You can go more broadly into the history of thought. Asclepiodotos is interesting because he is a philosopher of the late 5th century, early 6th century. So you don't know what kind of person you may find in an inscription. He's also, oh, bother. That'll teach me to put my stick in somebody else's machine, won't it? So you'll just have to look at the English. There are 2 epigrams on that stone. Let's go back. That's better. There are 2 epigrams, and one of them is in, you can see, if you look there, there's a little line between the 2. One of them is in the literary tradition and was recorded in the Greek anthology, and the other one was not. And there is also a variant between the version in the Greek anthology and the version on the stone. There are a lot of questions in my mind as to how that happened, and also what that may perhaps tell us about the circulation of these kinds of poems in antiquity, how they moved around. What did not happen is that what people used to think is that loving Byzantine scholars went round copying these things off the stone. That did not happen here. Something else happened. But I shall pass over that slide of shame. I was sure oh well, there you are. And here is another kind of social, religious detail. This is a perfectly respectable inscription, Roman documents, nothing funny about it. These are Roman documents written to the people of Aphrodisias. The inscription was put up in the middle of the 3rd century, and at some moment, somebody has erased Aphrodisias, Aphrodisione. They've erased mentions of the goddess throughout the text. It's extremely difficult to publish that in a way, to express it, to communicate it to a reader. But it's actually extremely interesting to see there are so many pagan things that are not erased, and it's very interesting when they are. So again, inscriptions may take you into all sorts of directions. And, of course, the history of scholarship, and that starts early. That starts in the 8th century, when people go round copying what they see. And it's sometimes quite dangerous. This nice story from an 8th century text describes a man who went looking at inscriptions, and one of the statues fell and killed his friend. Very dangerous. Archaeology has always been a very dangerous activity, and you should certainly take out insurance before you go on an excavation. This is a very extreme case, perhaps, but that's just a nice example. The interesting thing is this background of people going around looking at these inscriptions which they do not understand they know they're in Greek, they can read the words, but they have no understanding, or as little as we do, of what they're seeing. And here's a rather later example of scholarship, which for any of you who work with inscriptions know shows the greatest epigraphers of our time, Jean and Louis Robert. And what they did was that they added to the Winkelmann problem. Because we already have this tsunami of stuff, and what Robert said was, every single inscription has got to be given its full context and value. This is when these things are pouring out of the sky. You've got hundreds of them, and then here's Robert setting a new level of standard for the analysis. The volume problem becomes absolutely huge. And volume is one of the things that makes people fragment. You say there are too many papyri, there are too many inscriptions, there's too much, there are too many medical commentaries, or whatever it is. You look at all this stuff and you think, oh, I can't cope. And it's interesting, at the very first stages of digital applications in epigraphy, and to some extent in classics in general, was simply about dealing with volume. We've got lots of stuff, but we can put it into a manageable form, you can have it all on a CD, and then we can search it and sort it. It was a very simple volume response. And one of the things to think about with digital classics is to try to understand the journey that we have been doing since the application of digital tools began in the 70s or 80s. So first you have the Winkelmann to Robert journey. And then we have the civilized man, again, thinking about the tradition, coming back to Burke. Somebody who thought that you could put all Greek inscriptions into 4 beautiful volumes. The sort of last hope that you could do that. I just went to visit Inscriptiones Graecae yesterday, and 20 volumes are they talking about now? I mean, it's just without end. It's without end, and just when you finish your volume, what happens? You find 100 more. So, what difference has technology made to the study of inscriptions? Now, long before where we are now, the first important technological change is travel. It starts with those travellers with great difficulty who start moving. Italy is okay, Greece and Turkey are pretty difficult. until really late in the 19th century. So what is important? The arrival of the chemin de fer. And what you can see, and there's been some interesting studies, largely built by German engineers. And what you find is that since every German engineer has had a decent classical Bildung, while he's waiting for his permission, he goes out and digs another hole. And so archaeology and railways are very closely connected in the Eastern Mediterranean. But it makes it all possible. And then that's the other way of doing it. And in many cases, that's the only way. And it takes really until, well, when I first went out to Aphrodisias in 1970, the journey took at least 5 hours from the coast. And now it takes 3. So transport has been making a huge difference to how we understand the ancient world, but we don't stop and think about that. We take it for granted. We think, I will go back next year and look at that inscription again. We don't think that if we work in Syria. We don't think that if we work in Libya. But the barriers are no longer physical, they're not transport barriers, they're other kinds of problem. So transport really matters. It seems so primitive. And what's the next huge transformation? Photography. It's a really, really big change. Because it's all very well for us to talk about context. But actually, why did earlier scholars not give the context? Because it was so difficult to do. And photography gradually transforms things. I'm very fond of this. He's actually taking a squeeze. But I just love that picture of the hazards of recording. I think he took a photograph as well when he was up that ladder. But at this point, he's taking an abklatsch and filling everybody with admiration. He makes a very interesting remark. He says he travelled in Asia Minor before the First World War and after the First World War. And before, he only had a notebook. And afterwards, he had a camera and squeeze paper. The camera was slower than the notebook. Now, that's quite difficult for us to get our heads round, because by now that's no longer true. And the danger now is that because it's so easy to photograph, you run along, whip out your phone, take a photograph, and you don't really look. When you're drawing, when you have to spend time with it, you see things that you will not be recorded simply by your photograph. But that's very nice, isn't it? That shows you the sort of procedure that it was. It was complicated stuff, taking photographs. When I started taking photographs, going out there and making sure you had enough film. Half the people in this room haven't heard of film. Once upon a time, cameras needed film. And if you were out in the middle of Anatolia and your film ran out or got too hot, and also you didn't know whether your photograph had succeeded until you came home. The transformation of digital photography is just quite extraordinary. Again, it's just been happening without us noticing. But I would argue that, well, I have a great theory. I've been having theories about photography, a craft which I do not like. I don't like photography. But how would the internet have developed if there were no photographs? Would the internet how would it be used if there were no images? Would people use it with the enthusiasm that they do now? Whereas instead, it's become the repository for all the photographs people don't know what to do with. So they put all those boring photographs of their friends. So, online inscriptions. In fact, the very first projects were local projects, and they were on a local database. You wanted to go and see the Latin inscriptions that had been collected by the team in Heidelberg or by the team in Rome. You went to Heidelberg or you went to Rome and consulted it. And then gradually it became clear that this stuff could go online. It's very important to remember that the resources that we have online at present, most of them were not intended when they were first designed for a web which did not yet exist. And when we're criticising people for not being interoperable, which of course we always do and should, we have just to remember that's not where they started. They started somewhere else. And at the moment, we're living through a period of changing, of sort of retro conversion into the new world. So, Vindelander tablets come out in 2003. We published Aphrodisias in Late Antiquity, currently not available because we have a glitch at home, back home, in 2004. And very eccentric that was. But nobody thought it mattered because it's only late material anyway. So it doesn't matter if you do it in this funny way, and sort of funny thing Charlotte does, you know, but hey, nobody serious would do that. And the Packard materials go online in 2006. There'd been an interim when they were on disk. And now we're trying to, gradually all of us, trying to pull already this looks very old. 2007, I mean, you know, that's amazingly long time ago. But what it allowed us to do was to put in a lot of material, including old notebooks, lots of images, lots of context, lots of translation, and more recently, the inscriptions of Rome and Tripolitania, first published in 1952 with 1,000 inscriptions and 30 plates. And when I said to Joyce Reynolds, the author, but what about the photographs? She said, well, anyone can consult them. They're at the British School in Rome. What's the problem? And of course, in 1952, it would have been much too expensive. It wasn't really practical to publish 1,000 photographs. It probably still isn't. So that's the other big change, is that when she published that in 1952, because it was a respectable academic publication, of course it did not have translations. Because respectable academics do not translate, except occasionally into Latin. And as these were Latin, that would have been rather pointless. So she added translations for this new edition. The best recent product is this Marmar publication. Very, very, very nice product. Right. So, epigraphy and technology, should you mean higher standards, you're opening yourself up to more scrutiny, you have no excuse for leaving things out, and wider access. So what about classics? First, access. Some of you, I don't know whether anybody's old enough to remember HyperCard. Oh, how exciting that was. That was the wonderful thing about these projects, is that they had the courage to start when they did. They did it. They just got out there and did it, which is all you can do at this stage. I mean, that's rather what I've done. You just jump in, do the stuff. It may all go wrong, but hey, we've done it. It's a first possible example of what it might be like. Rather like that nice metro coming out to Krimelanka. Because is that the oldest? Is that the oldest U-Bahn in Berlin? No? But it's beautiful. It's lovely. It's like the one in Budapest is the really old one. Wonderful. Same sort of thing. This is sort of Budapest metro kind of version of what was to come. but what a vision. You know, let's see what we can do. But always remember, devised for a CD. Much easier to resolve a lot of problems because people who are comfortable with books can understand that a CD is a thing you hold in your hand and you own it. And publishers can sell it if they want to. So it was a very important transition. And there again, that's how it used to look, 1995, when it went online. 2001 for TLG. Not sure when Corpus Christianorum went online, but that's a very good example of a very expensive online resource. You guys probably don't use it a lot. It's useful for me, but it's jolly expensive. Whereas others are free. One of the most odd things about the world we live in at the moment is that if something is in digital form, you cannot guess what it will cost. There's no clear sense of what a market is. So you have no way of knowing whether it'll be free, whether it'll be $2,000 a year, or something in between. And it's very odd that that should be so. When you go into a bookshop and look at books, you have a feeling as to what they're going to cost. Most shops you go into, you have a feeling. But we're at a stage when those things have not yet become settled. And Pleiades, another resource which I'm sure you all use, just a wonderful example of a free resource. I think it is interesting that a lot of the things that, not all of them, but several of the things that are free originate in the capitalist United States, whereas in Europe, there's been quite a lot of, think about museums, there's been quite a lot of pressure on us to show how we can somehow produce monetary value for all this lovely money the taxpayer is giving us. There's a tension there, it keeps on shifting. Where you see it most, though, is still in the museum world, that some museums are under pressure to control their images and make money out of them. Whereas people like the Metropolitan, they know that's not where their money comes from. Their money comes from big, rich people coming along and giving them a great big wad of money. And the important thing is how they're viewed, not can I make money out of this particular photograph. So that's something to watch. It's again, a whole economy is developing that we don't know. So, communication. Well, here we are. This is communication. We communicate with people more than ever before. I can still remember sending an email to a scholar I'd never met at Tübingen because I was publishing something that he knew much more about than I did. And I sent him an email and I said, can I send you this stuff? The brilliant thing was we both happened to have the same Greek font. So I could send him my text. And by the end of the afternoon, he'd said he'd made some improvements in this thing I was about to send to the publisher. And I thought, this is the new world. It was just fantastic. Using email for a good reason as opposed to just the administration. So we have AWOL, everybody subscribes to that, and it keeps us going. What is really important is the possibility to rebuild the connectedness of classics. Important projects like the Homer Multitext, reuniting philology with the physical manuscript. I think that's going to be more and more important. Collaboration in working, the Perseids, you will have heard about that. Collaboration in the publication of papyri. We haven't got there with inscriptions yet because you know what epigraphers are like, but they believe they own their data. The wonderful Pelagios project, which I hope you all know about, which for us, the job we're doing at the moment is stuff from Libya, allows us, when we present material, to add an immediate link to the geographical data in Pelagios and to all the other material that Pelagios has assembled. That just seems to me a brilliant way of using the capacities of the web. In our material, the Latin text can be directly exported to other databases. That seems very, very desirable. Recently, I've been working on text in my Byzantine hat. And here we worked on texts. We have a Greek text with its Russian translation. They're not aligned. For those of you who know Russian, you will see that they're not, in fact, properly aligned, the Greek and the Russian in this particular case. And we were also working with, we were interested in citations of gnomic literature and how they appear in Arabic. We were exploring, in fact, the capacity of marked up text to be used to express relationships between text. And what that has meant, A, is me learning all about RDF, which I'd never heard of, and is what that, and you'll hear much more about that later this term by people who know much more than I do. But what is really interesting is that we have been working to try and think about relationships between texts. Because the relationships I've talked about so far with the inscriptions, the relationship between the inscription and the stone and its context and the statue and the institutions, those are quite easy. The relationships between two pieces of text are much more difficult. They need a lot of thought. And the only easy one, actually, is verbatim. That's the only really easy thing to say. But directly you want to say is variant of, is close translation. It's really, really difficult. So we developed an ontology of such relationships, which we very much hope that other projects are going to use and improve. We aligned our own ontology to other people's as much as we possibly could. And of course, the fun about RDF is that you can make diagrams of varying value. Not all ontology diagrams tell you anything, but they look awfully good. And sometimes something's going to come jumping out. So that we've been focusing more and more and more on the linking of data. And the linking of easy data and the linking of more difficult. All of you who deal on material objects, that's the easy stuff. It's thought that's difficult. And this, one of my colleagues did. I thought that would make you all happy. Because that's what we're trying to achieve. And wouldn't that have made the great Berliners of 1840 happy? Isn't that what they would have liked? They pulled everything together. They would, for example, not have excluded my Byzantines. They wouldn't have excluded the Arabs. They wouldn't have excluded people. They still were in the mindset of pulling the stuff together. And it's only through a rather misplaced professionalism of the later 19th and 20th centuries that these things have started to be fragmented again. Because it's easier to be a professor of Latin literature than to be a professor of the whole of Altertumswissenschaft. I mean, it's not going to happen. But the question is, what should the relationship of your expertise as a professor of Latin literature or a specialist in Greek pots, what should your relationship be to the cosmos of Altertumswissenschaft as a whole? How can we remind people that they do all belong to this? Well, I suppose the analogy is family. I think I won't use the European Union as the analogy, in particular, coming as I do. But I think the family is better because, of course, family is also about explanation, isn't it? It's about the reasons behind things. And we do need to try to use the tools we now have to reconstruct these relationships. Of course, another thing that has suffered en route to a wider classical world. I always say, this is one of my messages, if you want to train to mark up texts, it's just like translating from your own language into Latin. Actually, Greek is a bad example because it's easier. It's like translating into Latin. Now, I say this to audiences, people. How many people in this room have translated from their own language into Latin? The old ones. When I was in Tokyo, I met a friend of mine who was teaching classics there, and he said, yes, I'm off to teach my seminar. We're reading the Phaedo, and we're translating it into Latin. These are Japanese students. That's pretty impressive. I mean, that really makes you think. But one of the disservices that we're doing to our students at the moment is that we've removed that particular exercise from their education, as you can see. It's really useful, because what you learn is not the Latin. What you learn is to read the text that you are translating. And when you are marking up texts for any kind of digital transformation, the first thing you have to do is really read the text. It forces it onto you. So, I think all XML courses should start with a quick Latin course, with the very useful double, and you could have all the tags in Latin. The work that they're doing, the work they're doing with Alphaeus and everything, makes it more fun. Getting people to do this stuff online is easier. Same thing. Higher standards, wider access. And so we have so much possibility now to rebuild the subject in all its fragments, and also to communicate with one another in ways that we never could before. Admittedly, 100 years ago, I would have been giving this talk in Latin, because that's the language we would all have understood. That went on. My grandfather was a friend of, had a Dutch scholar who was his friend, and they only ever communicated in Latin. What else could they use? What would they have done? You need a wristband saying, what would Burke have done? Or what would Mommsen have done? Or what would Winkelmann do? Or what would Wilamowitz do? He's the other person I should have put in. To remind us of the various sides. The world of classics that they created was really exciting and really rich, and you walk through Berlin and you see evidence of it the whole time. We're in danger of not looking after that tradition properly. But now we can do it. So when people say, oh, I don't like all this modern stuff, the thing to tell them is we're on our way to 1840. Possibly not 1848, too sensitive, but 1840, 1843, but quite safe, mid-1840s, before the revolutions, that would be the safe place to go. So that's my message for Berlin. Thank you.